He knelt with irons at his wrists and a paper folded in the jailer's hand, the metal of the cell bars cold and unremarkable against the hush. Men passed outside, voices low, but inside the tower the air was thick with illegal machinery meant to choke truth. He had been stripped of rank, of freedom, of the work that gave his life shape. His thoughts were not of spectacle, but of counting the hours, of the small kindnesses he had been shown and the small cruelties he had borne. He knew how trials could be manufactured. He had seen law turned into theatre. The injustice was not sudden. It had been assembled by rumour, by whispered accusations, by commissions raised in private, by men who understood the law better than they respected it. He had friends in the courtyard and enemies in the privy chamber, and the two lists overlapped more than he liked to admit. The men who had called him loyal now called him traitor. He had been taken before a panel that would not judge him, but confirm what was already decided. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. From that cold beginning, the story moves without pause. This is the story of a man named George Boleyn, his sister Anne, and the force that would break them. It is also the story of the court that produced them. Sovereign, ministers, ambassadors, and a legal process used as a weapon. The Tower of London would be the stage on which their reputations were disassembled, and the scenes that follow are documented in dispatches, indictments, household accounts, and the testimonies that survived the purge. This recorded evidence will be the spine of what I tell. I will not invent secret passion or hidden conspiracies without support. I will describe in sequence the political calculations, the arrests, the interrogations, the trials, and the executions. What follows is grounded in surviving papers, diplomatic letters, court rolls, the indictment in Middlesex, the commission in Kent, the Privy Purse accounts, ambassadors' dispatches, and the chronicles kept at the time. The aim is to show how an accusation could be manufactured and made to look like law. It begins with family ties, factional disputes, and a king whose private life was suddenly public business. The Boleyns were at once intimate with the monarch and vulnerable to him. The violence that would take them was not merely physical. It was legal, reputational, and irreversible. Those are the facts that will guide us through every chamber and every step of the scaffold. Chapter 1 continues as the lift of Tudor power, ambition and fear converges on a handful of people who could not withstand it. George Boleyn's upbringing and early career illuminate why he was both indispensable and expendable. Born into the Boleyn household as the second surviving son of Thomas Boleyn and Elizabeth Howard, he was raised in an environment that combined ambition with cultivated learning. Education in the early 16th century for someone of his class meant languages and diplomacy. George spoke French, Latin and Italian, skills that took him to courts abroad and into the negotiation rooms of the era. He served as a diplomat in France and elsewhere, where contemporary dispatches remark upon his capacity for argument and his facility with court life. Anne's ascendancy to Queen transformed family fortunes. Thomas Boleyn advanced, and George's visibility increased. He moved readily among the Privy Chamber and on the King's advances, playing tennis and hunting with Henry VIII. Those same privileges made him vulnerable. Privilege in Tudor England meant proximity to power and exposure to jealousy. As Anne's influence with Henry shifted, so did the fortunes of her family. The Boleyn faction formed in defence of Protestant reforms and educational patronage, while other figures, most prominently Thomas Cromwell, grew impatient with their agenda. Cromwell's role in the dissolution of the monasteries generated wealth and intensified rivalries. When Anne and Cromwell fell out over the distribution of that wealth, political calculation replaced alliance. George had professed Protestant sympathies and used his diplomatic channels to move banned texts. These were political liabilities. He also shared with his sister a conspicuous intimacy that contemporaries noted as a close intellectual partnership. To enemies, that closeness could be cast into the language of crime. To friends, it was family. Already the machinery of accusation had the raw materials it would need: proximity, faction, and the sovereign's shifting desire. That combination would later be turned into charges that, on inspection, fit awkwardly against dates, movements, and the record of who had been where. The roots of George's downfall lie in this tension: an openly political family with private loyalties, a court that saw faction as treason, and ministers who believed erasure of a faction justified any method. The political landscape of early 1536 must be understood in practical terms. Henry VIII's search for a male heir, the religious reforms shaking monasteries and shrines, and the redistribution of wealth that followed dissolutions. Anne Boleyn had provided a daughter, Elizabeth, and suffered a miscarriage in January 1536 that profoundly altered the balance at court. Jane Seymour, whose comportment contrasted with Anne's, attracted the king's attention. This personal shift was immediately political. Anne had not been a mere consort. She was a patron and a leader of a reforming circle, intent on directing new wealth to charitable and educational enterprises. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister and architect of the administrative machinery of reform, had different plans. He sought the crown's direct control over monastic revenues, and he understood that Anne's influence could obstruct those plans. The friction hardened into political enmity. Cromwell had consolidated power by marrying administrative competence to ruthless calculation. When the crown's needs demanded a new queen and a subordinated faction, Cromwell had the motive and means to remove Anne and her circle. The sequence of events that followed, quietly raised commissions in Middlesex and Kent, the sudden cancellation of royal travel, the arrest of a musician, reads like preparation for a purge. To read the records is to see deliberate construction. The commissions provided legal ground. The arrest of servants and musicians opened routes to forced confessions. The suspension of routine travel kept witnesses dislocated. To contemporaries who recorded these moves, there was a pattern of deliberate orchestration. These moves were not improvisation. They were the work of officials who knew how to place charges where they would stick, how to extract testimony from vulnerable witnesses, and how to present an argument to a king desperate for a solution. Cromwell had spent years shaping the administrative state. He now used that structure as an instrument of removal. The arrest of Mark Smeaton in late April 1536 is one of the clearest instances of how the machinery was used. Smeaton, a musician in the Queen's service, was a commoner with no claim to leniency. The records show that he was taken to Thomas Cromwell's house and interrogated. Under interrogation, likely under coercive duress, he confessed to an affair with the Queen. That confession is singular among the testimonies because he was the only one who admitted guilt. The legal context matters. Nobles had privileges that constrained the kinds of physical pressure that could be applied. A commoner did not. Smeaton's status made him the ideal instrument to produce a confession that prosecutors could present as proof. The content of his confession, recorded in subsequent proceedings, supplied the prosecution with allegations of sexual impropriety between Anne and members of her circle. It also created an opening to accuse George Boleyn of incest with his sister. Why target George? He combined visibility at court with political independence. If Anne were removed but her brother was left, he could rally opposition. Arresting him and making the accusation of incest functioned to discredit the family and prevent any rehabilitation of their faction. The sequence continued with the sudden arrest of Sir Henry Norris and others. The king's own movements, an abrupt departure from Greenwich and the questioning of Norris while riding, added to the sense of coordinated action. In short order, men who had been close to the king found themselves incarcerated. Contemporary observers recorded bewilderment. The imperial ambassador, the Venetian, and others tried to reconcile what they saw with known facts. They could not. Their dispatches reflect the tension between what the court presented and what was plausible. For those who watched closely, the pattern suggested a legal operation designed to produce a political outcome. On May the 2nd, the arrests accelerated. Anne was arrested at Greenwich after a session of tennis. George was arrested at Whitehall. There is debate among historians about why George was at Whitehall when the court was elsewhere. Some propose he had rushed to the palace upon hearing rumours and walked into a trap. Others suggest mere coincidence. Either way, his arrest was quiet, deliberate, and rapid. He was taken to the Tower of London and confined in the Martin Tower, a place where many important prisoners were held before trial. Anne arrived in the Tower later that day. The proximity of their cells and the timing of the arrests have fueled speculation about what they discussed and whether they saw each other after imprisonment began. Surviving records are sparse on direct communication. Household accounts and some letters survive, but much is silence. Silence was part of the prosecution's advantage. It prevented public defence from forming and allowed prosecutors to control the narrative through indicted commissions and extracted confessions. Those commissions, formally directed to investigate alleged offences in Middlesex and Kent, supplied the legal frame. The indictments that eventually emerged set out dates and alleged behaviours, dates that, when examined against household records and diplomatic correspondence, often do not align. That misalignment is an important point. The indictments had the force of law in the moment, irrespective of their factual consistency. The court at Westminster Hall and the special commissions that tried the accused were instruments designed to make accusation appear as adjudication. They fulfilled a political rather than judicial role. The indictment against George Boleyn accused him of incest with his sister, using explicit phrases about kissing, presenting jewels, and specific dates in November and December 1535 and early January 1536. It also accused Anne and George of compassing the king's death, a treason charge that carried extreme penalties. Carefully compared to other records, these dates often do not match Anne's documented presence at court events. She can be placed elsewhere by household accounts and ambassadors' letters. Scholars like Eric Ives and Retha Warnick examine movement records. Discrepancies are serious and undermine the plausibility of the indictment. Nonetheless, the indictment performed a political function. By placing sexual deviance at the centre, it discredited Anne as queen and poisoned the possibility of sympathy for her family. The choice of language, emphasising kissing, tongues and gifts, shifted the case from policy disputes into the realm of moral outrage. The Tudor public, receptive to scandal about the monarch's household, responded to such language. In short, the prose of the indictment was forged to inflame. George's status as a nobleman should have afforded him trial by peers, the older custom guaranteeing a jury of equals. Instead, the prosecution arranged special procedures and commissions that limited those protections. The manipulation of process had a precedent in Tudor politics, but reached a new intensity in these events. What mattered was not the coherence of dates or the availability of reliable witnesses. What mattered was the appearance of guilt and the satisfaction of a king who'd been presented with apparently conclusive accounts. The rest would be minimised or silenced. Attention shifted to who would judge and by what standard. The jury assembled in the trials contained men with conflicts of interest. Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, George's uncle, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, and other nobles bound by alliance and fear. The selection of jurors was not neutral. It reflected the court's interests. The prosecution's case relied not on independent witnesses who had observed the alleged acts, but on intercepted gossip, coerced confessions, and the testimony of a vulnerable servant. Those procedural choices mattered because they redefined justice as a function of political survival. George's legal position was precarious. He might have expected a degree of fairness by law, but the Crown's will eclipsed formal protections. Modern legal historians emphasise how Tudor trials could be engineered. Commissions issued by the king, judges appointed selectively, juries composed of compliant peers. In George's case, the machinery functioned as it had been designed. The trial in Westminster Hall was massive, visible, and theatrical. Contemporary witnesses recorded the size of the audience and the charged atmosphere. Anne was tried first. She defended herself with precision and dignity, but was convicted. The vindication of justice rhetoric that followed her condemnation was a political necessity for the Crown. Her trial was meant to close off popular sympathy, to render her unworthy of further protection. When George faced his trial, he encountered not only the formal charges, but a spectacle that assumed his guilt. Despite that, several observers, Lancelot de Carl among them, remarked on George's clear-headed defence and forceful argument. He answered the charges in a way that impressed some observers. That calibre of defence made the verdict all the more obviously predetermined. George Boleyn's defence was recorded by several observers. He spoke with precision, addressed each article, and maintained that the allegations were false. Lancelot de Carl noted George's composure and ability to reply, comparing his performance favourably to that of Thomas More at his trial. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that George answered in a manner both prudent and wise. Yet the question remains, why, knowing the odds, did he respond as if the law might function on its own terms? The answer resides partly in his character, and partly in his calculation about posterity. George was a man of letters and arguments, steeped in scripture and debate. He could not abandon a defence even if its success was unlikely. He may also have sought to create a record that later generations could examine. A public denial could not be as easily suppressed as a private protest. The moment of greatest consequence during his trial was when a folded paper was handed to him that the court ordered him not to read aloud. It concerned the king's sexual capacity, rumour of Henry's impotence, and the paper suggested that Anne had told confidants about the king's inability. George read it aloud to the assembled crowd. That act was simultaneously defiant and explanatory. It exposed the logical weakness of charging Anne with adultery when the king's potency could be questioned, and it educated the public about the underlying stakes. Reading the note was dangerous. It mocked the king's masculinity, and therefore risked royal wrath, but it also punctured the prosecution's narrative. That single action, recorded by witnesses and carefully noted in foreign dispatches, stands out as an act of deliberate rupture against a judiciary that had already decided his fate. The paper George read contained gossip that had been circulating, intimations that the king lacked sexual vigour. To the court, that was a private humiliation. To George, it was evidence undermining the prosecution's case. If Henry could not perform fully, the allegations of his wife's adultery became less plausible. The point was not to insult the sovereign gratuitously, but to lay bare a contradiction at the heart of the prosecution. George's choice to read the note in public was not an accidental breach. It was a strategic, sacrificial exposure. He had little chance of acquittal. The jury was stacked, the commissions were in motion, and coerced testimony had been accepted as proof. By making the note public, George ensured that the weak foundation of the charges would be visible to the many witnesses in Westminster Hall and to the foreign ambassadors who recorded events. It was an act that targeted memory and the documentary record. Other aspects of the proceedings point to the engineered nature of the purge. The commissions in Middlesex and Kent had been convened only days before the arrests. The arrest of minor figures like a musician served a purpose beyond their individual guilt or innocence. Such figures could be brought to confess under pressure and then paraded as proof of a greater conspiracy. Contemporary ambassadors, Imperial, Venetian and French, sent dispatches in bewilderment. They noted the speed of the proceedings and the implausibility of some charges. The French secretary Lancelot de Carle and others recorded opinions that the charges against the Queen and her circle were manufactured. These external accounts matter because they often provide details absent from official English sources. They form a cross-check against the domestic records, and they point consistently toward manipulation rather than genuine proof. The role of Thomas Cromwell requires particular scrutiny. Cromwell had engineered administrative change on behalf of the king, and had enemies in the Boleyn circle who favoured a different direction for reform. His control of the legal and investigative apparatus made him the likeliest architect of a purge designed to clear his path. Cromwell had reasons to fear Anne's continued influence. Her faction proposed spending monastic wealth on grammar schools and church reform in ways that might limit ministerial flexibility. By 1536, Cromwell's hold on the king was strong enough that he could deploy legal instruments to remove rivals. That does not, in itself, establish motive for fabricating incest charges, but when combined with the pattern of arrests, the choice of witnesses, and the predisposition of jurors, Cromwell's involvement looks like a deliberate use of the law as a political weapon. The prosecution's reliance on coerced testimony amplified this effect. In Tudor courts, extraction of confessions from socially vulnerable figures, servants, musicians, and household staff, was a practical method of producing evidence. The mental pressure and physical intimidation available to interrogators in that period are well documented. Mark Smeaton's confession is the clearest example. The absence of independent witness testimony for the explicit acts alleged against the Queen and George remains telling. No reliable neutral observer ever came forward to corroborate the incriminating acts. Instead, the case rested on patterns of proximity and on suggestive but inconsistent dates. Those signatures of construction are what modern historians point to when they argue that the incest charge was invented to destroy a faction and to provide a legal pretext for the Queen's removal. The figure of Jane Boleyn, George's wife, has long been treated in popular accounts as the woman who betrayed her husband. That interpretation is both emotionally satisfying and historically flimsy. The surviving letters and the contemporaneous records show Jane Parker writing consolations to her husband and acting as a mourner for Anne after the executions. The image of betrayal grows from later sources that lack the contemporaneous corroboration found in household rolls and letters. Modern historians, Julia Fox among them, have challenged the idea that Jane testified against George. The evidence suggesting she did is weak, inconsistent, and often originates in retrospective narratives rather than trials records. Jane's actual position was precarious. As a noblewoman, she was bound to her husband's fortunes, but she was also part of the broader court network that could be punished for association. Her letters during George's imprisonment are tender and anxious, and she sought to intercede on his behalf. The myth of a vengeful wife endured, because it spoke to a broader moral desire to make personal scandal the engine of political catastrophe. But the sources push against that tidy explanation. Instead, Jane's actions depict a woman trying to salvage what she could in a situation shaped by larger forces. She could not prevent the weight of an administration determined to remove the Boleyn faction. She could not reverse the king's decision. Consequently, she became a scapegoat in later retellings, while the legal instruments and ministerial designs that produced the arrests remained less dramatically personified. The timeline from arrest to execution compressed events into 2 weeks of extraordinary legal violence. George spent 13 days in the Tower, time enough to contemplate and to prepare a defence, but not long enough to reform the political tide. During those days he received messages, including from Jane, and he fashioned a defence that preserved his dignity. Meanwhile, the king's administration pushed trials forward with a speed designed to prevent public outcry from developing into opposition. On May the 12th, men close to the Queen, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton, were tried and sentenced away from the usual protections. The sentences were harsh. Hanging, drawing and quartering was pronounced, though later commuted to beheading for the nobles. The practice of commuting sentences for nobles was not mercy but custom. It ensured that the victims died publicly, but in a manner ranked by social station. For George and the others, the public ritual of conviction served as closure for the court, and as a warning to potential dissenters. Yet public reactions were mixed. Contemporary chronicles record unease among observers. These men were not anonymous criminals, they were nobles and courtiers known in London, and their swift conviction disturbed civic sensibilities. The way the trials proceeded, special commissions, limited cross-examination, reliance on coerced statements, exposed a legal process that was pliant to the Crown's strategic needs. It is essential to note that not every official in the machine was unmoved. There were tears and discomfort among jurors, and some participants, Norfolk among them, later recorded regret. Those human gestures did not alter the outcome. The morning of May 15th was the day that would define public memory. Westminster Hall hosted a packed assembly. Anne was tried first and conceded many of the procedural facts but denied guilt. She defended herself with precision and a register appropriate to her rank. The verdict was guilty. Then the court turned to George. The assembly was unusually large. Estimates range into the thousands. The trial could not be private procedure because the Crown needed spectacle to complete the purge. The record of George's answers survives in fragmentary form through contemporary accounts. He answered each article with rational clarity. Witnesses later testified to his composed bearing. One account, that of Charles Wriothesley, emphasises the sharpness of George's speech and his insistence on truth. Yet the formal judgment followed what the court had determined before the opening plea. The jury, as composed as it was of peers whose loyalties lay elsewhere, returned the verdict of guilty. The legal language of the verdict emphasised both moral depravity and treason, and the sentence was pronounced in the name of preserving the king's honour. That phrase, preserving honour, was a public justification, and it reveals a central tension. What the king or court proclaimed as honour could be constructed out of accusation. The law became not a means of adjudication, but a source of legitimation for prearranged policy. One incident in the trial that surprised contemporaries was George's decision to read aloud a paper he had been ordered not to read. The paper suggested Anne had discussed the king's sexual inadequacies with confidants. Reading it aloud was calculated to expose the contradictions in the prosecution's account and to embarrass the sovereign in full hearing. Foreign secretaries wrote that the act was audacious and that it had the effect of rendering the proceedings absurd to those who recognised the king's private difficulties. For George, the choice was existential. He could attempt an appeal to the jury's conscience, or he could reveal the weakness at the heart of the accusations. He chose the latter. That action has been interpreted in two ways by historians. Some see it as foolhardy, a last-minute attempt to save a reputation by humiliating the king. Others see it as deliberate martyrdom. George knew that the trial would convict him, but wanted to secure a record of the prosecution's vacuity. Given the composition of the jury and the political stakes, the latter interpretation appears plausible. He could not alter the immediate outcome, he could only shape the memory. The act of reading a forbidden paper to a packed hall ensured that the instrumental nature of the prosecution would not be hidden. For contemporaries in the hall, for the foreign ambassadors who dispatched reports, and for the citizens watching the proceedings' aftermath, the gesture left a deep impression. The next steps moved toward execution. The legal machinery had produced verdicts. The administration now had to carry them out in a manner that both punished and communicated. Sentences that might have been grotesque, hanging, drawing and quartering, were commuted for status reasons, leaving beheading as the method for the nobles. Along with the executions came burial arrangements and decrees that would signal the end of the Boleyn family's influence. The 5 condemned men were prepared for public death on Tower Hill. The scaffold was built high for visibility. The function was less punitive than performative. Henry VIII sought demonstration of royal power and of the law's reach. But the spectacle did not produce the unanimous approval the court anticipated. Many in the crowd felt unease. Several chroniclers record that the executions disturbed public sensibilities. When George stood at the scaffold, he gave a speech that appears in versions across chroniclers. It followed the conventions of the age, confession of sin in general, appeal for faith, and warning to courtiers about the vanity of the world. Yet it included a distinctive insistence on his Protestant convictions, and an affirmation that he had sought to promote the gospel. That insistence complicated the prosecution's narrative. George did not falsely confess to the particulars of the charges. He framed his life in broader terms of faith and fallibility, admitting to human sin but not to the incest or treason of which he had been accused. Those present recorded the speech, and its tone was taken as both pious and defiant. The execution would not suffice to make him a non-person. The immediate aftermath of the executions produced ripple effects. Thomas Wyatt, for one, watched from his tower window and later recorded the image in verse. The sight haunted him. Wyatt's surviving poetry captures the psychological and moral shock of watching the state's violence. His image of the axe and the heads in the street becomes a symbol of courtly dispossession. For Londoners who witnessed the events, the spectacle reinforced the sense that even the highest courtiers could be brought low. Newcastle's chroniclers and foreign ambassadors conveyed a similar unease. In diplomatic dispatches, the French and imperial secretaries questioned the coherence of evidence and noted the swiftness of procedure. Those outside England saw something that domestic sources had trouble acknowledging: politically convenient prosecutions and the use of law as instrument. In private, some members of the court recorded regret. Norfolk's tears when sentencing, whether sincere or performed, indicate at least an awareness of the moral weight of condemning kin, but regret did not translate into action. The machinery had set the course. The fate of the Boleyn circle was sealed, and the execution of Anne and her brother would, in the immediate term, finalise Thomas Cromwell's consolidation of power. It would also create a historical paradox. The Boleyns were eliminated at a cost of reputational damage to the crown that would complicate later memory. The execution of Anne Boleyn 2 days after her brother's death, carried out within the Tower walls and with a French swordsman rather than the English axe, concluded the purge. Anne's execution was conducted in less public fashion, and with a degree of care that acknowledged her former rank. That selection, an imported swordsman and a private gallows, was both mercy and statement. It signalled the Crown's ability to meet differential punishment based on status. Anne's last speech preserved a measured dignity. She maintained denial of the most egregious charges and framed her narrative within Christian vocabulary. Her death, like her brother's, was recorded in dispatches that later travelled through Europe. In diplomatic circles, the question that remained was simple. Were these acts of statecraft or acts of injustice? The evidence that has survived strongly suggests the latter. Anne's removal opened the path for Jane Seymour's elevation and advanced Cromwell's immediate designs. But political success yielded a legacy of controversy. Historians have long argued that the charges against Anne and George were legally engineered rather than proven by independent facts. The inconsistencies in dates, the absence of credible witnesses, and the reliance on coerced confessions point to manufacturing rather than discovery. That interpretation has become the prevailing view among modern scholars with access to household accounts and diplomatic correspondence, though debate persists about motive and about whether any genuine indiscretions occurred in the Queen's household. What is indisputable is that the legal process operating in May 1536 did not resemble a neutral adjudication. Public reaction did not conform to the court's intentions. Instead of satisfaction, the executions produced an uneasy mix of horror and scepticism. For some, the executions confirmed the king's supremacy and the decisiveness of the government. For many others, they demonstrated the volatility of royal favour and the fragility of reputation. Word travelled quickly through London and beyond. The narrative that emerged in civic memory emphasised the human cost of factional politics. Writers and poets registered the event differently. Some sanctified the dead in prose, others used the episode as a meditation on the perils of court life. Over time, the sense that George and Anne had been unjustly condemned hardened into a strand of Tudor historiography, critical of Cromwell's methods and sympathetic to the Boleyns. That historiographic shift was facilitated by the survival of foreign dispatches and by later historians' access to household records and the trial's documentation. The documents allowed a reappraisal that rejected the surface-level appearance of legal propriety. Instead, they showed a pattern of orchestrated accusation and controlled testimony. The question that follows is governance. How could a legal system be turned so effectively into an instrument of political retribution? The answer lies in the Tudor crown's centralised power and its willingness to wage law as warfare against factions. The mechanics of extracting confessions in Tudor England must be addressed directly. Interrogations often use psychological pressure, isolation, and threats. In the cases connected to the Boleyn purge, interrogators had leverage. They could promise leniency to lesser figures who admitted to wrongdoing, or threaten worse treatment for those who held out. Mark Smeaton's confession bears the mark of interrogation under pressure. He was the solitary admitted offender among the accused, and his social status made him especially vulnerable. That practice does not prove malicious intent in every case. The Crown's legal representatives believed they were preserving social order from supposed corruption at the heart of the monarchy. But the ease with which confessions could be manufactured and then mobilised for higher charges demonstrates how fragile justice could be under political pressure. For nobles, the threat was reputational rather than physical, but that threat was often sufficient. The case of the Boleyns shows how the apparatus of state, commissions, interrogators, palace officials, could be coordinated to produce desired outcomes. Cromwell's network understood how to deploy those instruments to remove political obstacles. The lessons of May 1536 extend beyond the Boleyns. They indicate that law in Tudor England could serve immediate political priorities, and the consequences for individual lives were catastrophic. The archival residue, letters, trial rolls, and ambassadors' notes enables reconstruction of those methods and reveals why modern historians see the purge as engineered rather than emergent. Evidence matters. The indictment's specific dates often conflict with household records and embassy dispatches. Eric Ives and others compiled itineraries showing Anne's movements on the dates alleged in the indictments, and those itineraries do not consistently support the charges. Contemporary accounts from ambassadors at the French and imperial courts show scepticism and detail the compressed timing of commissions and arrests. The way the prosecution presented the sequence of events in Middlesex and Kent ignored available records. That selective presentation of evidence is a crucial sign of fabrication. Moreover, the use of special commissions rather than customary trial by peers for certain accused reinforced the administration's grip. The legal exceptions that were carved out for this purge demonstrate a willingness to sidestep traditional protections when convenience required it. The Boleyn case thus became a test for the limits of royal power and the vulnerability of nobles' legal privileges. The conclusion of many historians is clear. The charges were not substantiated by credible, corroborated evidence, and were instead a political construct. The result was fatal for George Boleyn and lethal for Anne. Their executions eliminated a faction and reconfigured the court, but they also left a record of injustice that subsequent observers would not easily forget. Personal records and letters from the period add texture to how the accused comported themselves. George's surviving letters convey a man of reflective piety. He engaged in theological debate and cared about the spread of reformist texts. He had used diplomatic channels to move prohibited Protestant pamphlets into England, acts that exposed him to political vulnerability if the court's balance shifted. His identity as a reformer made him suspect in a court where religious offence could be as dangerous as political dissent. Yet the letters show tenderness toward his wife, and a desire to defend the family's honour. Jane Boleyn's letters, meanwhile, are full of entreaty and worry. Contemporary household accounts show gifts and minor household expenses that indicate family ties and normal courtly exchanges, rather than the behaviour of criminals. These details do not prove innocence by judicial standard, but they reveal the texture of ordinary life around the Boleyn household. That ordinariness stands in marked contrast to the extraordinary accusations then levelled. By comparing mundane records against the indictment's lurid claims, historians see the discrepancy that points to manufacture. It is in that mismatch between household receipts and sensational charges that the injustice becomes clear. The chronicles and diplomatic dispatches of the period supply external perceptions that challenge the Crown's narrative. The imperial ambassador Eustace Chapuis repeatedly expressed astonishment at the speed and content of the prosecutions. He reported rumours and his own interpretations back to the emperor, but never found the evidence to corroborate the incest charges. Lancelot de Carle's long poem-cum account written for the French court presented a damning picture of the events and insisted the charges were baseless. Foreign observers were not neutral. They had their own interests and biases, yet their consistent perplexity is significant. Those dispatches acted as a contemporary check on English official accounts, and later served historians as crucial source material. They documented the reactions of an international community that could not reconcile the legal language of the indictments with the record of the accused men's public conduct. The resulting historiography draws heavily on those foreign reports, precisely because domestic records were often instruments of the administration. Combining household documents and foreign dispatches allows a more reliable reconstruction of what likely happened. The cultural frame of Tudor justice helps explain why the purge was possible. In a monarchy where personal favour determined fortune, a king's private preferences could be transformed into public policy instantaneously. The rule of law existed, but the king's prerogative could bend it. Ministers like Cromwell understood the leverage existing in administrative reform and could enact commissions to pursue political goals under legal cover. The public could be persuaded by spectacle and by the moral framing of accusations. Charge sex and deviance and you shape popular moral outrage. Charge treason and you remove legal protection. The combination of moral and legal framing made prosecution efficient. That is a structural lesson rooted in institutions, rather than personalities alone. Individuals acted within a system that permitted legal instruments to be applied selectively. The Boleyn Purge is a case study in how institutional design enables political purges. The individuals most responsible, Cromwell, the king, and their immediate advisers, used the levers available to them with grim effectiveness. After the executions, the Crown proceeded to erase and reframe. Anne's marriage was declared null and void. Elizabeth's legitimacy was temporarily revoked. The effect was to rewrite precedent and to manage dynastic succession quickly. The legal acts that followed the executions were as consequential as the executions themselves. They regulated inheritance, patronage, and memory. For the Boleyn family, the damage was comprehensive: loss of offices, confiscation of certain properties, and a tarnishing of reputation that impeded later rehabilitation. Yet rehabilitation did occur, slowly and unevenly. Elizabeth, once on the margins of legitimacy, would become queen and would in certain acts restore her mother's memory by reversing previous decrees. The arc from purge to rehabilitation underscores the contingency of reputation. It also reveals how statecraft can create temporary legal facts that later claim reversal. In the immediate aftermath, though, the surgical objective was achieved. Cromwell's enemies were removed, Jane Seymour was installed as queen, and the court stabilised under a different configuration. The human cost remained, and the archival traces of that cost sustained later historians' judgments. Consider George Boleyn's final words and actions as an interpretive key. On the scaffold he acknowledged sin in broad terms but did not concede to the specific acts alleged. His words warned courtiers against flattery and vanity and affirmed his Protestant convictions. He framed his death as a moral lesson and an admonition to those around the throne. That posture fits a man who understood the politics of reputation and the use of public performance. By aligning himself with reformist piety, he reclaimed moral authority even as the court stripped him of legal standing. Contemporary accounts of his speech were recorded and disseminated. They protected his memory in ways the court could not remove. In effect, George's final act was to secure a moral counter-narrative that outlived the political purge. For the public and for later readers, those words made it difficult to accept the simple narrative of criminal depravity the prosecution had offered. Instead, they supplied a moral complexity that questioned the premises of the trials themselves. The burial of the executed men at St. Peter ad Vincula within the Tower's chapel is a final administrative footnote with symbolic weight. Burials in that chapel were reserved for those whose lives had been bound up with the court's affairs. They were neither anonymous paupers nor saints in shrines. The interment of George and the others there placed them in a liminal memory, honoured enough to be buried within the Tower yet condemned publicly. The duality is appropriate to their legal status, convicted traitors, yet former courtiers of distinction. The site became a locus of memory for those who later questioned the justice of May 1536. Poets, chroniclers, and later historians visited or wrote about the chapel, noting the incongruity of the graves. The physical facts, the stone, the place, the funerary rites, endure as a material record that contrasts with the legal rhetoric of their condemnation. Those material traces helped later generations read the events with skepticism and empathy. Memory and material evidence combined to sustain a counter-history to the official narrative. The long-term political consequences were complex. In the short term, Thomas Cromwell strengthened his hand and orchestrated a succession that favoured his administrative ambitions. Jane Seymour's marriage to Henry the Roasty stabilised the court for a time and produced the male heir the king desired, albeit one who did not survive his father. But the means by which Cromwell secured his position created enemies and resentments that would later be his undoing. In 1540, Cromwell himself was executed on charges that bear the stamp of political calculation and legal engineering. His fall underscores a recurring theme. The instruments of political purge are often turned back on their makers. Cromwell's success in 1536 did not guarantee his survival. The same combination of royal caprice and factional rivalry that removed the Boleyns would later remove him. The Tudor court functioned as a revolving theatre of favour and condemnation. The moral is institutional. Systems that permit law to be used as political weapon will produce cycles of purge and retribution. Historiography of the Boleyn affair reflects changing attitudes toward evidence and toward the role of ministers like Cromwell. Early chroniclers recorded events with political biases. Later historians with access to archival evidence reconstructed timelines and countered the most sensational claims. The consensus among serious modern scholars is that the incest charge lacks credible corroboration, and that the prosecutions were politically motivated. But historians continue to debate degrees of culpability and the relative agency of Henry Cromwell and others. Some argue that Henry's personal motives, his desire for a male heir, his impatience with Anne's influence, were primary. Others stress Cromwell's administrative opportunism. The truth is likely a composite, a king motivated by dynastic anxiety, a minister who could produce legal instruments, a factional rivalry that escalated, and a series of tactical decisions that culminated in legal spectacle. The archival record supports this multi-causal view. Beyond politics, there are human stories that paperwork obscures. The Boleyn family suffered deeply. Thomas Boleyn lost reputation and hope. Elizabeth Howard suffered the loss of daughter and son by public legal means. Jane Boleyn survived but bore the weight of later slander. Their grief does not easily translate into the state records that historians use. A ledger cannot capture the small practical calamities of confiscated incomes, unpaid debts, or ruined marriages. We must also recognise the everyday servants, musicians, and household staff who were implicated, interrogated, or compelled to testify. The social network that sustained court households found itself under suspicion. Lives were disrupted, not only for the noble family but for the supporting staff. That ripple effect is often ignored in grand political narratives, yet it is part of the event's human cost. The psychological effect on those who witnessed the events was significant. Thomas Wyatt's poetry shows the trauma of watching executions from the Tower window. Other courtiers recorded dismay. The spectacle of state violence reverberated through court and city. People reconsidered the safety of proximity to power. Talent and favour were no longer reliable shields. That lesson would inform later behaviour. Courtiers became more circumspect, alliances more guarded, and patronage networks more secretive. The culture of caution that followed helped shape the Tudor court's later composition. Patterns of patronage altered. The memory of May 1536 acted as a cautionary tale about the risks of visible favour. Consider the documentary record as a contested field. The Crown issued proclamations and used its channels to shape public understanding. Foreign ambassadors recorded their versions and distributed them outside England. Household accounts and letters preserved mundane details inconsistent with the sensational charges. Later, chroniclers wrote narratives shaped by partisan commitments. The historian working in these sources must weigh each type of document for bias and reliability. Patterns emerge. Where the Crown's records seem designed to present legal propriety, external accounts and private papers often complicate or contradict those presentations. That pattern underlies the modern consensus. The official case was built on brittle foundations. Yet the historian's task extends beyond declaring fabrication. It requires explaining how and why the administration could assemble such a case, and why contemporary observers sometimes accepted it. The answer combines institutional design with personal motives. The Boleyn affair also invites reflection on the relationship between law and spectacle. Trials in Tudor England often had theatrical elements, but May 1536 magnified those elements into political strategy. The court needed to demonstrate decisive action, to eradicate a faction, and to produce a legal justification for action that was essentially political. The staging of trials, the building of a scaffold, the procession to execution, and the public pronouncements all formed a communicative project. This instrumental use of legal theatre shaped public perception and served short-term political goals. But it also undermined faith in legal fairness, as contemporary observers noted. The erosion of confidence in legal process destabilised trust in government and left a moral residue. People remembered the injustice even as the immediate politics of succession were resolved. Questions of gender and reputation surface in the Boleyn story. Anne's position as queen amplified scrutiny of her sexuality and political choices. In a patriarchal court, the sexualized accusation functioned both to discredit a female ruler and to reassert masculine control. The incest charge attacked not just personal morality, but normative structures about who could sit near the throne. For George, the accusation of incest was particularly destructive because it combined sexual scandal with treason, making rehabilitation nearly impossible. The gendered dynamics of the accusation were instrumental. By portraying the Queen as sexually deviant, the prosecution justified removing a political obstacle. That tactic has ample precedent in early modern courts, where women in power could be undermined by attacks on morality. The rehabilitation of Elizabeth and the partial restoration of family fortunes in subsequent reigns complicate the final accounting. Elizabeth's accession in 1558 allowed for posthumous reassessments and restoration of her mother's memory in official and ceremonial ways. Some legal acts reversed the adjudications made in 1536, and the history of public commemoration shifted toward a more charitable view of Anne and her kin. The process was not simple or comprehensive, but it demonstrates how political memory can be revised. The Boleyn case thus stands as an example of how legal verdicts in one generation can be reassessed by another when political conditions change. That posthumous rehabilitation cannot erase the immediate cruelty, but it complicates moral judgment across time. The Boleyn story also enters the history of Tudor religious change. George's circulation of Protestant texts, the Boleyn's patronage of reformers, and Anne's support for clerical reform positioned the family within the reformist camp. Cromwell's administrative reforms likewise advanced aspects of the Reformation, but on a different practical basis. The intersection of religion and policy made factional conflict not only about money and patronage, but about theological direction. Religious conviction could be a liability when factional debate turned to survival politics. George's identity as a man committed to reformist ideas complicated his legal vulnerability. Reformist activity that had been tolerated or even prized in certain circumstances became incriminating when the political winds shifted. The fate of the Boleyns thus illuminates the fragile boundary between religious advocacy and political threat in Tudor governance. We must also note the role of rumour and gossip in creating evidentiary atmospheres. The Tudor court thrived on rumour. Households were nodes of information and mischief. Rumours about the king's sexual capacity and the queen's private conduct circulated in public and private. Such rumours could be amplified into legal charges if the administration chose to treat them as proof. The case shows how ephemeral talk could be institutionalised into formal accusations that destroyed lives. For historians, tracing rumour to documented judicial consequence is a useful way to understand how social forces become legal ones. Individual actors mattered. Thomas Cromwell deployed legal instruments he had helped build. Henry VI made choices guided by dynastic anxiety and personal taste. Norfolk and other nobles performed roles that balanced family, loyalty and fear. Each actor played a part in producing the outcome. The systemic explanation, institutions that allowed legal manipulation, is necessary but not sufficient. Personal ambition, miscalculation, and the king's temperament were part of the causal chain. That mixture of personal and institutional causation is why the Boleyn affair continues to interest historians. It is a case where character and structure converge to deadly effect. The Boleyn narrative also raises ethical questions about historical memory. How do we allocate responsibility across decades and archives? How do we reconcile contemporary legal forms with modern standards of evidence? The historian must avoid presentism, yet demand rigorous evaluation of the sources. In the Boleyn case, a careful reading of trials, itineraries, household records, and diplomatic dispatches supports the conclusion that the incest and treason charges were manufactured to achieve political ends. That conclusion does not turn the accused into immaculate martyrs. It places them within a world of contested values and brutal politics. The duty of historical writing is to lay out the evidence and the reasoning so readers can see how conclusions are reached. The final lessons are sober. George Boleyn was a man whose intelligence, learning, and political activity made him both useful to and dangerous for a crown that accepted thin legal pretexts when they served the goal of factional elimination. He chose to read a paper aloud in a trial he could not win because he valued the truth of certain claims and wanted to expose a fundamental contradiction. His choice sealed his fate but also preserved his voice for posterity. Anne's death followed, and the family was broken. The purge achieved an immediate political result, but at a cost to the moral authority of the court. Thomas Cromwell's ascendancy was temporary. He too would later fall to the same instruments he had used. The cycle continued as a pattern in Tudor governance. In the cold ledger of history, the Boleyn purge registers as an example of legal violence administered for political ends. The indictments, the coerced confessions, the composed jury, the staged trial, and the public executions combined to accomplish a political cleaning. Yet the human testimony, the letters, the speeches from the scaffold, the poetry of witnesses like Thomas Wyatt, and the diplomatic dispatches refuse to let the events become simple. They insist on the complexity of culpability and the tragedy of lives destroyed by systemic calculation. The final image is not theatrical flourish, but sober fact. George Boleyn chose to die speaking what he believed to be the truth. That choice left a record that questions the legitimacy of the process that condemned him. The executions removed a faction and rearranged succession, but they also left a stain on the mechanisms of royal justice. Over time, memory partially restored reputations, and the arch of history judged the episode as a miscarriage. The dark reflection is this: systems that permit law to be bent by preference and faction will produce injustices whose reverberations last long after the scaffold is gone.